Okay, so today is going to be largely the anatomy or just really the structures of the ear, looking at all the different aspects of the outer, middle, and inner ear. And then Wednesday's class will be more so how all that stuff works, right? All the function and the physiology part of it. Okay, so let's start out with the external ear. So the part that we can see, that we think of, that we call the ear, it's called the auricle, right, or the pinna, and its function is actually to collect sound, to kind of catch it, right? Um, we don't think of this too much in ourselves, but we definitely think of it in dogs, right? When you think about a dog or a coyote or a wolf or something that we've seen like turn their ear towards where the sound's coming, right? They can actually do that, right? They can control their ears in such a way where they can try to catch sound coming from behind them. And part of that is driven by sensory or touch receptors in the actual external ear. And we have receptors, touch receptors in our ear that sense where the sound is coming from as well. So it gives us an idea of the direction of the sound. We just can't move our ears to follow that, but like other animals can. And then we move into the auditory canal, right? The external auditory meatus. This is just that passageway to the middle ear. Contains these ceruminous glands, which are what make earwax. Right? And earwax is helpful for trapping debris so it doesn't get all the way down deep inside of our ear. Also helpful for catching insects or making insects not want to go into our ears um, when we're sleeping, right? We got all kinds of bugs in our houses and our dorms, right? And yeah, looks like a fun little place to crawl into for sure. But earwax actually makes it so certain insects won't go in there. But I grew up in the mountains up in Julian, actually. And I was sleeping outside with a buddy one night and just like camping on his like porch. And one of those big pincher bugs, they're called earwigs, actually, but they're long and skinny, have these big pinchers on the end. One crawled into his ear and was like literally like pinching his eardrum. So yeah, so bugs for some reason like to crawl in places like that. But anybody ever had something crawl in their ear like that? No, don't want to admit it. It's okay. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, earwax can help us with that a little bit, but okay. Making our way in. So now to the inner ear, or sorry, the middle ear. This is known as the tympanic cavity. Okay. And it's just important to note that the external ear and then the middle ear as well are all air filled, right? Those are air filled spaces. Okay. Once we get into the inner ear, it's going to be fluid filled. Okay. But this is lined by a mucous membrane. The boundary between the eardrum, the boundary of this is the eardrum on the external side, and then the oval window on the internal side. So the most lateral border of this is the eardrum. It's also known as the tympanic membrane. And then the medial, if we go in towards the brain, then it's what's called the oval window. Okay, so a tympanic membrane, the eardrum, is not completely flat. It kind of has this cone shape to it. And that cone, the point of the cone is pointing medially towards the brain. It's actually just skin on the outside, right? So when you look in someone's ear, you're just seeing the skin covering that tympanic membrane, but then it's mucous membrane on the inside. And this is a very important part of our hearing mechanism because it is pretty much converting that sound, or at least taking the sound that was traveling just through the air as sound waves to now converting that to more a different type of mechanical energy and really just making it so those little bones start vibrating, right? It's kind of taking it from just vibrating the air to now vibrating the membrane, but then that membrane is attached to the little auditory ossicles, and then those auditory ossicles move. So we're kind of just converting it into vibrations at this point. Okay, so we got the tympanic membrane, and then we've got those three little bones, right? And here's a good idea of their size. If you can see it next to somebody's fingers there, right? So there's three of them in a row. They actually have little synovial joints connecting them, right? So they have a synovial membrane, a capsule, just like your shoulder or hip, right? And they're filled with synovial fluid, and they move around quite a bit, right? But they're tiny. Okay, so there's the malleus, it looks like a hammer. The incus, it looks like an anvil. I'll just show you what an anvil is on this side in case you weren't sure. That's an anvil. The only place, I mean, this is kind of like what a blacksmith uses, right? Like where they take it and they're like pounding on it to like make a sword or something. I remember just like cartoons where they would like drop an anvil on another character's head for some reason. That's the only time I really saw them as a kid. But yeah, and then the stapes or the stirrup, right? So think of like stirrups, the things that the old time baseball players would wear that have like the two stripes going up the side of their lower leg. That's the stirrup, right? Yeah, and so the function of these is just to transmit that sound, right? The eardrum is connected to one of them, right? And then that one's connected to the middle one, which is connected to the last one, and then that last one's connected to that oval window. Okay. And something that's kind of interesting here is we actually have little muscles that go up and attach to these bones that can be contracted in a reflexive manner when we have a loud sound that enters our ear. And so these tiny little muscles tighten up the joints between the ossicles when a loud sound is received. So it's like this auditory reflex that happens, super loud sound comes into our ear. There's the sensory receptors in our ear, send a signal to spinal cord, we get signal back, contract those muscles and just squeeze those joints together so they don't move as much. And that pretty much acts to dampen the amount of sound that gets transmitted all the way to the inner ear. Okay, so take a second and just check in with the people on your team with that question up there on the right. What is the order of these three bones? And really it's asking you which one of these touches the eardrum. Okay, go ahead. Talk with the people on your team for a sec and then vote.
But it was
That diagram helps, right? Yeah. All right, go ahead and send it in if you haven't yet. I've got 50 responses so far. Okay, anybody else? Still missing a few, it looks like. I'll leave it open for a sec. Let's go ahead and everybody hit send just to make sure I can get a count on how many clickers we got today. Okay, yeah, so I'm missing a couple. Okay, all right, yeah, so 84% of you are saying A, the malleus, and that is correct. And so we can see that pretty clearly somewhat clearly on the next slide. It's a little bit of a weird view here, but we can see the malleus is the one here that's connected to the eardrum, right? Then we can see the incus here in the middle, and then the stapes. We don't see its connecting point because of the way this image is kind of sliced. But that's going to be the one that is connecting right to that oval window. It's going to connect into the inner ear. Okay, one other aspect to the middle ear is it has a connecting point to the throat, right? That's what this pharyngotympanic tube is, also known as or used to be known as the eustachian tube, right? We open it more so when we yawn, when we move our jaw, right? So when you're like driving up into the mountains and you need your ears get kind of plugged up, a lot of times people will chew some gum or just kind of do that adjustment thing, like kind of a fake yawn to open it up, right? And you're just opening it up. And so the function here is, since that middle ear is an air-filled space that's not necessarily open to the outside world. The external ear is open, so that pressure can always regulate, but the middle ear is not open except for that pharyngotympanic tube. So we need something to be able to just equalize the pressure when the pressure changes, right? So if we're here at sea level, air has quite a bit, there's quite a bit of space between us and the atmosphere, right? And so that's our barometric pressure. That's our pressure that's kind of pushing down on us, right? Which makes the air kind of compressed. And then if we go up into the mountains and that eustachian tube, that pharyngotympanic tube is plugged, then it's that same air that was kind of compressed is in our middle ear, and it doesn't get to equalize with the outside. And so then that just creates a vacuum pretty much, right? Now we have more pressure on the outside of our eardrum, so that eardrum kind of pushes in, right? Because there's higher pressure outside than there is inside. So that eardrum kind of like smashes in and it feels uncomfortable when it does that, right? And so we just have to kind of try to open that up, and then that pressure can equalize between the outside and the inside. Our eardrum can kind of go back into its resting place, right? So that's really the point of that. Questions on any of that? Okay. All right, and then we get into the internal ear, or the inner ear. Okay, so this is a very, very delicate membranous structure, fully embedded in bone. Right, so it's just totally in this little tiny cavity inside of our skull. Right, it's fluid filled. All the structures that we'll talk about inside here are fluid filled. Right, so the two sections of the ear we were just talking about are air filled, but these are all fluid filled. Okay, and there's three primary regions: the semicircular canals, three looped canals, all next to each other. Okay, these give us awareness of rotational movement of our head. Okay, so spinning in all three planes, really, right? In all three kind of, yeah, dimensions. Okay, then we have the vestibule. The vestibule is this egg-shaped cavity, the one that's kind of closest to the starting point, that oval window. It has two primary functions, gives us awareness of the position of our head. Right, so when we close our eyes, we can still be aware of the fact that our head's upright or it's back or it's forwards, right? Even with our eyes closed, we have that awareness, and that awareness comes from our vestibule. Okay. And then this also tells us about linear movements of the head. So moving straight forward, up and down, side to side. Okay. Whereas those semicircular canals are the spinning, rotational movements. These help us with linear movements. And then we have the cochlea, right? The cochlea is that snail-shaped part that is where we do our hearing. Also connected to nausea and vomiting, but primarily focused on hearing. Okay. Which cranial nerve connects all this stuff to the brain? Check with the people on your team real quick. Number and name. Okay, what number is it? 8, yeah. Vestibulocochlear nerve, right? So we got the vestibule part and the cochlea part. Semicircular canals are kind of left out of that, but the vestibular apparatus can kind of sometimes, by some definitions, include the semicircular canals as well. And so the nerve actually does split into two parts as it comes down. There's a part that goes to the cochlea and the part that goes to the other two structures. Okay, any questions on these so far? All right, so the next slide is just an opportunity to label all of these things. Okay, so we got A, B, and C, the large regions, and then a bunch of little structures in there. So go ahead and fill all those in as you're going. And I'll open up the clickers for this question down here. You're going to send in a number, not a letter. So write all that in. Definitely don't wait for me to open them up. What do you mean? Yeah, that would be awareness of linear movements of the head. I just happened to put teammates at the same table. I
Oh, we
didn't,
got one.
I didn't realize that.
Third class.
Oh, you too? All right, wow, that's amazing. Sorry, Emma.
Now.
Yeah. That's amazing. I didn't realize that. Is there any other track girls in the class? So all three ended up with the same.
All the rest of them were.
That's crazy. You guys all are on the same team. I did not know that.
According to the muscle. Tympanic nerve.
Oh, I think the I think 3 is the tympanic membrane.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah.
Pharyngeos, kind of, is that pharyngeos?
Oh.
So it connects your pharynx to your tympanic cavity. So it's pharyngotympanic. Yeah. Pharynx is your throat.
That's not, is it like easier?
Yeah.
I can't.
All right, so you're gonna put a number in there. If you're not sure how to put that number in, just check with somebody at your table. Sure, somebody can help. And then make sure you hit the send button.
No, yeah.
Yeah, wait. It's 5 and 8 pointing at the same thing.
5 and 8. Where is 5 and 8? 5 is, yeah, I think one of them is one of the bones, and then the other one is the thing behind the bone. Make sense?
Oh,
Yeah, I think so. 6, 7, and 8 are the bones,
okay.
and then 5 is just the thing that bone is touching. All right, go ahead and send that number in there. Make sure to hit the send button. All right, I think we're still maybe about 10 people short on that. So make sure to hit the send button on this type of question. Got to hit send for it to go in. I'll leave it open here. All right, it's still open, but let's go ahead and start walking through this real quick before we go through this. I just forgot to mention at the beginning of the class, I've added some more office hour slots for this week. So happy to sit down with you, answer any questions you have on the material leading up to the exam. So again, you can find that link on Canvas right on the homepage of our course, or the office hours link in the modules. Grab a slot there, come by, ask your questions, or if none of those work, just come talk to me after class and we'll figure out a time for you for us to meet too. Okay. All right. So let's start with the clicker question here. So 76% of you said 9. Okay. And what do we call number 9? Yeah, those semicircular canals. Perfect. Okay, let's start with number 1 there. So that is our, we got the regions first, external, middle, internal. So we got the auricle, the pinna. Number 2 there is just that canal, it's just the hole, right? So external auditory meatus. We got the tympanic membrane, or our eardrum. Number 3, 4, we've got that pharyngotympanic tube. Just to help you with that word, the pharynx is your throat, right? And then the tympanic cavity is your middle ear. So it's just the tube connecting those two spots, right? Pharyngotympanic tube. Okay. Number 5 is the oval window. This is the beginning of the internal ear. Okay, and the stapes connects right to it. Okay, and then we got the bones, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. Number 9, as you said, was the semicircular canals. Number 10 is the vestibule. Okay, it doesn't look like much, just a little bump right there. Okay, 11 and 12 are the 2 branches of the nerve that we talked about. So the vestibular portion of the vestibulocochlear nerve, and then the cochlear portion of that. Okay, and then 13 is the cochlea. Okay. Questions on any of those? Go ahead. Mostly just grouping them together, but it's pretty clear on an image, like just by what it's going to, you know, and yeah, so I don't think I have any questions like that, but if I did, I think it should be pretty clear either like physically, visually, you can see where it's going, or just by the name, you know what it would do too, right? So, yeah. Other questions? Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the middle ear, possible pathologies in the middle ear. How many people had a middle ear infection when they were a kid or even sometime recently? Yeah, this is a pretty common complication of having a cold, right? Because what happens is you get that infection in your throat somewhere, right? And then especially when you sleep, you're laying back, sometimes that your pharyngotympanic tube opening is right there. So you got all that mucus, all that stuff just right there. Virus, bacteria, whatever it is right there. And then it can kind of make its way up into your middle ear, right? And especially with babies, because there's not much room, not much distance. So it's a lot more likely for that to happen. And so, yeah, this is called otitis media, right? Just middle ear infection. This could be bacterial or viral. Okay, very common in kids and infants. And yeah, because it's shorter and it's a little bit different shaped, just because of their growth pattern. And so when you look in the with a otoscope, which is that little thing the doctor uses to look in the nurse uses to look in your ear, you might see bulging like that, right? So you can see where the cone portion of the tympanic membrane would be pushing the other way, right? That's the middle part, but the rest is just like bulging out towards laterally. And that's pus back there, right? That's what that white stuff is pus behind it, creates a lot of pressure. And so then that air-filled space is supposed to be air-filled, right? It becomes fluid-filled with pus. And so then those bones don't move as well, right? And so we try to getting sound from our external ear to our inner ear is hampered, right? Because those bones aren't moving well. So everything sounds kind of like dampened, right? We don't hear the full sound because it's just like sluggish moving those bones through that pus pretty much. Okay, if it gets enough pressure, it can rupture your eardrum. If this happens lots of times, and you get lots of pressure in there, they have to put a little hole in it, a little tube to kind of allow that to drain. I'm sure some of you probably have had that. And yeah, antibiotics, if it's a bacterial infection, or the tube would be the best treatment for that. So questions or crazy stories about any of that? Yeah, Wesley?
Just like when you have a cold and you lead into an ear infection and the type of infection it is.
Exactly, yeah.
Like, how's it connected to the nose? Like, you know, like from the, like, I would clear my nose, and I'll have stuff coming out of my ear doing that.
Yeah, like when you go to blow your nose, you actually like you feel stuff moving around in your ear. Wow. Yeah, that means your tympanic membrane is ruptured at that point, right? If it's actually if something's leaking out of your ear to a great extent, then that means there's a little bit of a separation between your tympanic membrane and where it connects to the ear. So yeah, so just by creating that pressure by blowing your nose, then that just creates more pressure inside your middle ear, and then that can rupture your eardrum right there. But it can kind of seep through too. If you have a lot of pressure in there, it doesn't have to necessarily rupture. It can kind of seep through and you can kind of get like slow dripping there. But if it's more of like a steady flow, then there probably is like a little rupture in that tympanic membrane. So it's mostly about pressure fluctuations when you blow your nose, but also, yeah, I mean, your nose, when you have something in your nose that's causing an infection, it's draining right there where your pharyngotympanic tube opens up into your throat. And so it's all really close in there. So the infection can move up in that direction pretty easily. So, yeah. Other questions on that? Yeah, yeah. For the most part, yeah, usually there are some cases where they have to surgically kind of pin it back down, but for the most part, it does just heal on its own. Yeah. You can also get traumatic ruptured eardrums by like, this happens somewhat of a common surfing injury, where somebody lands on the water really hard and water just gets shot in there and it can burst the eardrum that way. So yeah. Okay. All right. Well, let's keep on going here. So the common structure that we find in all of the little structures inside of our inner ear is a receptor of the nervous system called a hair cell. Okay, and it looks like this, right? So we can see neurons connected to that hair cell. We can see these little hairs on top called the stereocilia. Okay, and then that cell is always going to be embedded in something solid to kind of hold it in place. But we're going to find this in the semicircular canals, the vestibule, and the cochlea. They're all going to work in slightly different ways to get stimulated, but we're going to talk about each of those a little bit now and then more so on Wednesday how they work. Okay, this is a microscopic image of what those look like. Okay, we've got those stereocilia on top, supporting cells, and then they're all connected to cranial nerve 8. Okay, these are mechanoreceptors, right? The nervous system receptors that respond to movement, mechanical stimulation, right? And so that when they bend one way, that can cause depolarization of those neurons. Typically, when they bend back the other way, that causes hyperpolarization. And both those signals mean something to the brain when the brain is either receiving more of a signal from that neuron or less of a signal. So let's talk about each of those little structures inside the inner ear and some unique parts of each of them. Okay, so the cochlea, we'll start with that. So again, it's a snail-shaped thing that is all kind of wound up just like a snail shell, right? And if we were to unwind that snail shell, we would see that there's 3 separate canals inside that. So the upper canal, the middle canal, which is called the cochlear duct, and then the lower canal. Okay, so again, they're all fluid-filled. The upper canal is where we receive sound. This is the one that's connected to that oval window that the stapes was connected right to. Okay. And then the lower canal is what's going to allow sound to exit our inner ear, exit our cochlea through the round window. Okay, so oval windows on top, connect to that upper canal, round window down below, connected to the lower canal. Okay, and then the cochlear duct's in the middle. The cochlear duct is the one between the two. It contains special little structures called the organs of Corti, also known as the spiral organs. Okay, this is where hearing transmission occurs. This is where we find those hair cells, is in that middle cochlear duct in the organs of Corti. Okay, so each of these structures we'll talk about, the cochlea, semicircular canals, and vestibule, there'll be a unique little organ inside that has the hair canals, or the hair cells in the cochlea. It's the organ of Corti that has that. Okay, so here's a good example of that. If we take that cochlea and just unwind it, if we could lay it down like that, which obviously you can't do, but if you could, then we would see that these little bones shake around, right? That moves the stapes is moving back and forth. And just think of this like a speaker, right? If you've seen a speaker moving when sound is going through it, it's a big membrane going back and forth, right? It's the same idea. That membrane's going back and forth, and when it does that, it transmits vibrations through this liquid in the upper canal, right? And then that liquid, or that vibration, is of a certain frequency. Okay, and what we have here is we have something called the basilar membrane. So the bottom part of the membrane that holds this, that encloses the middle canal, the cochlear duct, is called the basilar membrane, and it varies in its stiffness. Okay, so the very front part of it, the very part closest to the oval window, is very stiff, and it can only get shaken around by very high frequency vibrations. Okay, so vibrations closer to 20,000 hertz. Okay, and then once we get out towards the end, it gets less and less stiff as we move out towards the end. Okay, all the way down to the very end of it down here is only going to be able to be shaken around with vibrations of very low frequencies around 20 hertz. Okay, and that's pretty much our audible range of hearing sound is between 20 and 20,000 hertz. And it's all dependent on the stiffness of this little basilar membrane. Okay, so when sound comes in, it's just gonna keep going until it gets to the portion of the basilar membrane that kind of matches with the frequency that sound is. And once it hits the correct frequency, then it vibrates that part of the membrane, which then moves the sound through. Then it gets down to this lower canal, and it goes out the round window, and it's done. But it's only sound that passes through that middle canal that we actually hear, because that's where the organ of Corti is. If it's a frequency that we can't hear, like too high pitched of a sound, like the ones the dogs can hear and we can't, it just goes all the way here, wraps around, does a U-turn, comes through here, and we're never aware of that sound because it doesn't actually vibrate the membrane that moves those hair cells. Okay. Questions on that at all? Wesley? Yeah.
So is it like it reaches a certain point and then vibrates, or is it like vibrating at all, like going through?
Yeah, so it's vibrating the liquid the whole time, right? But then that liquid's ability to vibrate the membrane is going to be dependent on where we're at in that membrane. But usually a sound that comes into our ear contains many frequencies, right? And so part of it's going to stimulate this part, then part of it's going to stimulate further, right? But if it's just a uni pitch sound that goes in, then it would really just stimulate one part. It would pass through the cochlear duct there, and that's all dependent on that stiffness of the membrane there on the bottom. And we'll get into that a little bit more next time too as well. But Alexia, yeah. It's a great question. It's not related to that membrane changing, but it is related to the hair cells being damaged, and we'll talk some more about that next time too. Yeah, good question. And so dogs, animals like dogs that can hear much higher frequency sounds than us, their basilar membrane is longer, just has a larger range of stiffnesses, and so that's why they can hear different frequency sounds than we can hear. But yeah, so this just kind of walks us through what I was just kind of talking us through here. Again, that spiral organ is what the organ of Corti is. The floor of it this is the floor of the cochlear duct, like we were just looking at that middle canal. Okay, the ceiling of it is called the scala tympani. Okay, again, it's flexible, it moves with the sound waves. The end that's closest to the oval window is the stiffest part, responds to the high frequency sounds only. The furthest away part is less dense, more flexible. So the function of this basilar membrane is to support that spiral organ, but then to allow some movement for whatever frequency of sound is going to be passing through. So that's the bottom, okay? And then the top membrane in that middle canal is called the tectorial membrane. Okay, this is the ceiling of the organ of Corti. Okay, it doesn't move at all, right? It's very inflexible. So the function of this is to provide a stiff surface for the cilia to move against. Okay, I'll let you finish writing that, and then I want you to look up here for a sec. Okay, so when we got our hair, those hair cells, we picture those little stereocilia sitting here, we would have the bottom of it embedded in the basilar membrane. Okay, and then the top is embedded in the tectorial membrane. Okay, so if they both move together, then the hair cells wouldn't get bent at all. Those little hairs would just go and there would be no bending, right? So it makes sense to have one that's stiff, one that moves. So the bottom one moves and the top one doesn't. And by doing that, that pretty much makes it so the hairs get bent, right? And that's exactly what happens. So the tectorial membrane is stiff, basilar membrane moves, and that's what allows for bending of those hair cells when that frequency of sound passes through. Okay, so that's kind of what that's explaining there. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and head over to this one. This is just going to be another brief labeling. Go ahead. Yeah, you want to just write that down more? Yeah. Yeah, so go ahead and label the next image there. And there is a clicker question there on the bottom as well for you to answer. Thank you. So this is just kind of a close-up of that organ of Corti, that spiral organ. You can see those different membranes, the hair cells.
He uses.
All right, so you're sending in the answer to that clicker question there on the bottom. All right, give you about 10 more seconds to send that in. Maybe about eight or so more of you. Okay, so about 60% of you are saying B, and then we got about a third of you saying A. So what is A? Who's confident to yell that one out? What's A? That's the tectorial membrane, right? That's the one on top. That's the one the hair cells, the hairs themselves, the stereocilia are embedded in. So that's going to be the stiff one that doesn't move, right? And then B is going to be the basilar membrane, the one that does move depending on the frequency of sound. Okay? So B is the correct answer down here. Okay. C is those stereocilia themselves, those hairs, and D is the hair cells. There's inner and outer ones. We won't go into the difference between those two for this class. Okay, questions on any of those little structures? Give you a sec to finish writing those down. Okay. Gonna move on to the vestibule. All right, so that's our cochlea. The vestibule, again, has those two main functions that we talked about. Lets us know about linear movements of the head and just position, static position of the head. Okay. The special structure we find on the inside, the special structures are called macula. Okay, and there's two different ones. One of them is called the utricle. The other one is called the saccule. Okay, these are both kind of right at the base of the cochlea. All right, so these macula, they contain this thing called the otolithic membrane. And so oto is referring to the ear, and then lithic is referring to rocks, pretty much is what it is, right? So we have little stones embedded in this membrane that give it some weight. And we'll talk about why that's important here in a sec. But we have two of these things that are identical, the utricle and the saccule. The only difference is their position. So the utricle is going to be parallel to the base of the skull when your head is upright. And the saccule is sitting perpendicular when your head's upright, right? So one's like this when your head's upright, the other one is like this when your head's upright. Okay, so this is this like jelly-like membrane with these little stones of calcium to increase its weight. Okay, so the way that we bend the cilia in this case doesn't have anything to do with sound waves or anything like that. It's about that otolithic membrane moving when our head moves or when it changes positions. Okay, so take a sec here and label these little structures and answer this question here based on just kind of putting some things together and what you can come up with. Okay, go ahead. No, that's typically kind of buildup of little crystallized pieces in your semicircular canals is typically when that happens. But those are supposed to be really fluid-like, and fluid's supposed to just move around. But as we age, it kind of dries up sometimes, and so then they can get little rocks in there. Have you had that, or your parents had that?
I did sports medicine in high school.
Oh,
We had
okay.
an athlete who had it. It was
Hmm.
really interesting.
Yeah, it's like a common cause of vertigo. Yeah, it's pretty disorienting for sure, but it is crazy. The older, like, I used to go on all the fair rides and everything, and like it didn't bother me. Now I can like barely like go on a swing. It's like so I get like dizzy like so quick. It's so weird. Yeah, but yeah. All right, so you're just sending in one of those two macula, the one you think that would be the one that responds to vertical movements. Just take a guess. If you have no idea, that's fine. We'll talk about it. Give you about 10 seconds to send that in. All right, good. Looks like we got everybody there. So we got 40% saying B and then 25% saying A, something like that. So what did you call A? What was that one called? The utricle, right? So it's one of the macula, but it's specifically the utricle. And then B is also a macula, but it's specifically the saccule. Okay, the utricle one is the one that's supposed to be more perpendicular to the base of your skull, and the saccule is more. I'm sorry, I said that backwards. The utricle, the first one there, A, is more parallel to the base of the skull, and then the saccule is more perpendicular. And so you could just imagine if we have those little stones on this part here, and we jump up, right? What's going to happen? The weight of the stones is going to kind of pull down, and that's how we become aware of that. But when we're looking at the other one, if we move upwards, that doesn't really do anything, right? We have to move side to side. That's what's going to move those stones with the one that's parallel to the base of the skull, right? So B is the correct answer here for sure. Okay, the one that's going to be perpendicular to the base of the skull, the saccule. Okay, but that obviously depends on the position of your head. If you put it forward, then you go up and down, then that changes everything, right? But they're both helping us respond to those movements. Okay, C is the stereocilia again, right? We can see how they're embedded in this jelly-like membrane. D is those little rocks, right? The little otoliths. And then E is that membrane itself, that otolith membrane. And then again, F would just be the fibers of that vestibular nerve. Okay, questions on any of this? Okay. All right, looks like we're mostly there. Okay, let's go into our last structure of the inner ear. Oh, sorry, yeah, that just said saccule, but that was B. Okay, all right, so our semicircular canals are our last ones. These are helping us to detect change in rotational movement of our head. We'll get into more of the dynamics of how this works next time. But again, we've got these three different canals. They're fluid filled. They have this thing called a cupula, which is just this little point that kind of sticks up in the center, okay? And then embedded in that cupula is where we have the hair cells. These are found at the base of this thing that's embedded there called the ampulla. Okay, so the ampulla is where the hair cells are embedded. The ampulla is embedded in the cupula, okay? Lots of crazy words with this one for sure. Lots of wild little structures that when they're not functioning properly, we can barely move, right? Amazing little structures, very, very important for us. So the bending of the cilia in this case is driven by that fluid actually moving around the canals. It kind of like spins around the canals, okay? And then it moves that little thing that's sticking up, you'll see on the next slide, over as that fluid hits it. And then that bends the hair cells inside of that, okay? So we can just walk through this one together. So the endolymph is the fluid, okay? And so that fluid's like spinning around those canals, right? The cupula is the thing sticking up in the middle. The hair cells we can see there, okay? And then that hair cell bundle. Okay. Okay. And I'll leave this up here for a sec, but if you're done, go ahead and move on to the next slide, which is the table there. That's just a nice little recap for looking at these three structures we just looked at. Fill that in and we will finish up with that, okay? And just to make this a little bit clearer, hopefully, this kind of whole bottom portion of each semicircular canal is what we call the ampulla. Okay, so each semicircular canal has one of those ampulla, or you can't see that. Yeah, so that whole bottom portion is the ampulla. And then we have the cupula, which is the part that sticks up, right, that the hair cells are embedded in. Okay, hopefully that's a little bit more clear on what's the ampulla and what's the cupula. The ampulla is just the bottom part of the semicircular canal. Cupula is the thing that actually sticks up on the inside where the hair cells are embedded. Okay. All right. Yeah, so hopefully we're able to fill this in. The one thing I'll help you with is just to make sure what is the receptor region of each of these, right? So we have the organ of Corti here. Okay. In the vestibule, where we were just talking about, are called the macula, right? And we have the utricle and the saccule. And then the semicircular canals, those hair cells are found in the cupula. Okay, obviously this is sensitive to sound. This is sensitive to linear movements. This is sensitive to rotational movements. Okay, and the function is pretty much connected to the stimulus that they're sensitive to. Okay. All right. Have a great rest of your day, guys. We will see you on Wednesday.